Send them home, they're hopeless. That's what a high-ranking British officer said about 14,000 Australian soldiers, just 48 hours before those same men would save his entire regiment from total annihilation. April 8th, 1941. The Libyan desert is burning. Erwin Rommel, the man the world will soon call the Desert Fox, has just done the impossible. In 11 days, his Afrika Korps has smashed through 500 kilometers of British defenses like a knife through hot butter. 2 British generals are already in captivity. Command posts obliterated. Supply lines severed. The remnants of His Majesty's once mighty army are fleeing east, abandoning equipment, supplies, and what's left of their dignity. And in the middle of this total chaos, there's one single point on the map that Rommel hasn't taken yet. Tobruk, a tiny port town on the edge of Libya, surrounded by crumbling Italian fortifications with no air cover, no tank reserves, and absolutely no chance of rescue anytime soon. Inside this doomed perimeter, 25,000 men, almost 14,000 of them, Australians from the 9th Division, the same soldiers a British colonel had just called quote _2_ and suggested be sent home. But here's the thing, and I need you to hear this. This is not a Hollywood fairy tale. This is not a screenwriter's fantasy. This is documented fact backed by military reports, memoirs, and German war archives. This is the story of how professional army snobs from London almost made one of the most catastrophic mistakes of World War II, writing off the men who would, in a matter of hours, save their own units from complete destruction. But before we get to that blood-soaked dawn of April 11th, when German tanks rolled into the assault, you need to understand something critical. Where did this poisonous, almost racist contempt from British command toward soldiers from a faraway southern colony even come from? Because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about discipline, about heroism, and about who the real soldiers were in the deserts of North Africa. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the enemy respected these men more than their own allies ever did, and why one word from Rommel himself proved the British were dead wrong. Let's go. The roots of this toxic conflict go back a quarter of a century, deep into the muddy trenches of the First World War and the dusty, sun-baked streets of Cairo. It was there, in the year 1915, that a deep and ugly crack first appeared between the British High Command and the Australian Volunteers, a crack that would never truly heal. It all began when thousands of young Australians, farmers, shearers, gold prospectors, and miners landed in Egypt on their way to the Dardanelles. They had arrived to serve the Empire, but the Empire made it clear from day one that it did not consider them equals to its professional regiments. General Sir Archibald Murray, who commanded British forces in Cairo, sent a memorandum to London that became one of the most cited documents in the history of Australian-British military relations. The wording was absolutely devastating, as he wrote that he had never seen a body of men in uniform with less idea of discipline than. And formally, Murray had plenty of reasons for his disgust. The statistics he cited looked absolutely staggering. 5,924 cases of intimate diseases were recorded among Australian servicemen in Cairo, while British units stationed right next door had only 1,979 such cases. Australians staged drunken riots in bars and entertainment districts. They set fire to an entire red light quarter in the Wazir district of Cairo, and firefighters had to battle flames in several houses simultaneously. On transport ships, incidents of insubordination bordering on mutiny were recorded constantly. Officers complained that Australian soldiers refused to salute, address commanders by their first names, and ignored any attempts to enforce standard military order. But here is what is truly incredible, and what the British generals stubbornly refused to acknowledge in their reports. The very same men who drank until they lost consciousness in Cairo taverns and refused to polish their boots transformed into absolutely different creatures on the front line. Brigadier General Ludlow, who observed the Australians near Ypres, left a note that perfectly illustrates this paradox. He wrote that the Anzacs were very brave men, but essentially they were just a mob in uniform. The phrasing was derogatory, Yet the first part of the sentence about their bravery somehow always got lost in headquarters briefings. And meanwhile, it was precisely this bravery, multiplied by stubbornness and a complete lack of fear of authority, that 26 years later would turn this so-called mob in uniform into the most resilient garrison in North Africa. But this was only the first act of the great collision between two military cultures, and the contradictions only grew sharper as time went on. General William Birdwood, who directly commanded Australian units at Gallipoli and on the Western Front, tried to explain the root of the problem to his British colleagues. He wrote that these men belonged to the most socialistic communities in the world, for whom saluting was equivalent to a degradation of human dignity. Birdwood, being British by birth but having spent years with Australians, understood what the London staff officers could not or would not understand. Discipline in the classical British sense, impeccable uniforms, snapping to attention instantly, blind obedience to any order regardless of its rationality, was not just alien to Australians, it contradicted the very foundation of their national character, forged in the harsh conditions of colonial Australia, where respect was earned not by shoulder straps but by the ability to survive. This cultural fault line had a very specific legal basis that drove British generals into a frenzy. The Australian government, back in the First World War, categorically forbade the use of the supreme penalty for desertion against its servicemen. The British Army sent deserters to the firing squad by the hundreds. Over the years of the First World War, more than 300 British and Dominion soldiers stood before firing squads. Australians were the only major force of the Commonwealth whose soldiers could not be put against the wall for fleeing the battlefield. For the British command, this was not just a legal anomaly, it was a personal insult to the entire system on which the imperial military machine rested. How can you command an army if you do not have the ultimate tool of intimidation? And here lies the paradox that British generals could never resolve. Australians, who could not be sent to the firing squad for desertion, fought on the front lines with a ferocity that regiments with centuries of history and iron Prussian discipline did not demonstrate. The Germans on the Western Front quickly learned that attacking a sector held by Australians was an extremely ungrateful task. They were silent in defense, ruthless in counterattacks, and absolutely unpredictable in night raids. But the staff rats in London and Cairo did not see this. They saw statistics of offenses, and they were monstrous. Australians had the highest percentage of unauthorized absences, drunkenness, and disciplinary infractions among all Commonwealth forces, which meant, by the logic of armchair strategists, they were completely hopeless. But these were just the early signs of trouble. The real drama waited ahead in the scorching sands of Libya, where more than 20 years later, this old stereotype would nearly cost the British Empire the entirety of North Africa. When the Second World War began in the year 1939, Australia entered it automatically as part of the British Commonwealth. The 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th Divisions were formed from volunteers and sent to various theaters of operations. The 9th Australian Division, which would soon become the main protagonist of this narrative, was staffed with men whose biographies would have horrified any British drill sergeant. Among them were cattle herders from Queensland, miners from New South Wales, dockers from Melbourne, and even former vagabonds who had walked thousands of kilometers along Australian dirt roads during the Great Depression. Many of them signed up for the war not out of patriotism, but because the army provided 3 hot meals a day and boots without holes. By the year 1941, the British High Command in the Middle East already had a fully formed opinion about Australians, inherited directly from the staff officers of the First World War. In official correspondence, the phrase undisciplined colonials appeared constantly, and this was the polite version. Complaints poured in an endless stream. Australians did not shave, wore their uniforms as if they were going to a picnic, ignored salutes to officers, and, oh the horror, called their commanders mate right on the parade ground. For the caste system of the British Army, where the difference between a private and an officer was comparable to the difference between a serf and a lord, this looked like the end of the world. The situation in North Africa by the beginning of April 1941, meanwhile, was rapidly rolling towards a catastrophe. The Italian army of Marshal Graziani which the British had crushed in the brilliant Operation Compass in the winter of 1940 and 1941, capturing 130,000 prisoners, turned out to be just a prelude. Hitler, furious at the disgrace of his ally Mussolini, sent Lieutenant General Erwin Rommel to Libya with 2 divisions, the 15th Panzer and the 5th Light. Rommel arrived in Tripoli on February 12th and immediately began to act against direct orders from Berlin, which instructed him to wait for reinforcements. He did not wait. On March 24th, Rommel went on the offensive, and the British command, relaxed by the easy victory over the Italians and weakened by the transfer of their best units to Greece, turned out to be completely unprepared for what happened next. In 11 days, German tanks covered 500 kilometers. Benghazi fell. Mechili fell. British generals Neame and O'Connor, the very same O'Connor who was the architect of the brilliant Operation Compass, were captured after getting lost in the desert in their own car. It would have been a comedy if it hadn't been a tragedy of strategic scale. The entire system of British defense in Cyrenaica collapsed like a house of cards under the blow of a sledgehammer. And so, by April 10th, only one point of resistance remained on the map. Tobruk, an old Italian fortress with a semicircle of concrete fortifications stretching for 47 kilometers along the perimeter. Inside, a garrison of 25,000 men, almost 14,000 of them were Australians of the 9th Division, under the command of Major General Leslie Moreshead. The rest were scattered British and Indian units that had retreated to Tobruk from other sectors of the front. Tanks, miserable remnants. Aviation, practically zero. Supplies, only by sea, under constant bombardment by the Luftwaffe. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare, because the real problem of Tobruk lay not in the lack of weapons. The real problem was that a significant part of the British High Command simply did not believe that Tobruk could be held, and they certainly did not believe that it could be held by undisciplined colonials. General Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in the Middle East, gave Moreshead an order to hold out for 8 weeks. The wording itself was eloquent. 8 weeks? And then, apparently, evacuation or surrender was expected. Some staff officers in Cairo openly discussed the scenario of surrendering Tobruk, considering it inevitable. In their reports, familiar phrases about the lack of discipline among Australians and doubts about their ability to withstand a serious German assault slipped through. One British colonel, inspecting positions 2 days before Rommel's first attack, saw everything that any graduate of Sandhurst would have seen: unshaven faces, unbuttoned collars, and soldiers playing cards instead of cleaning weapons. And he delivered his verdict: hopeless, send them home. 48 hours later, this same colonel would be praying to God that these hopeless men were nearby when the German panzers began their assault. Leslie Moreshead, whom subordinates privately called Ming the Merciless, or simply Ming, named after a villain from comic strips, though later associated with the mysterious Min Min lights of the Australian outback, was a man of a completely different breed than those British staff officers who judged combat capability by the length of trouser creases. A school teacher from Melbourne, he had gone through Gallipoli in the Western Front of the First World War, received several wounds, and brought one unshakable conviction out of the trenches: the only discipline that matters in war is the discipline of fire. When the British inspector's verdict was reported to him, Moreshead, according to eyewitnesses, merely shrugged. He had more important things to do. For example, preparing a defense perimeter 47 kilometers long for an assault by one of the best tank generals in the world. Moreshead issued an order that became a legend. He announced to his officers that there would be no Dunkirk and Tobruk, no evacuation, no retreat, no surrender. Every meter of the perimeter would be defended, and if the Germans broke through, a counterattack must begin immediately, without waiting for orders from above. This was a revolutionary decision. In the British Army, soldiers waited for orders. Moreshead's Australians were given the authority to act on their own initiative at the squad and platoon level. Every sergeant became a small general in his sector. Meanwhile, Rommel was preparing the assault with the swiftness and self-confidence characteristic of him. The Desert Fox was convinced that Tobruk would fall just as easily as all previous British positions. His intelligence reported that the garrison was demoralized, devoid of support, and consisted mainly of the same troops he had been chasing before him for the last week and a half. No one bothered to inform Rommel that inside the perimeter there were now completely different people. Not the battered remnants of defeated brigades, but a fresh, angry Australian division full of determination for whom the word retreat did not exist in principle. The morning of April 11th, 1941, dawned with a deceptively calm sky over the Libyan desert, but beneath it the gears of a war machine were grinding into motion. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was about to unleash his first serious assault on Tobruk, confident that the undisciplined colonials inside the perimeter would crumble just as the British had before them. The 5th Light Division, spearheaded by tanks and supported by infantry, slammed into the southwestern sector of the defenses known as Ras el Medouar, with the full expectation of breaking through and rolling straight to the harbor. Rommel's plan was brutally simple: punch a hole in the old Italian fortifications, pour his panzers through, and crush the garrison before they could even organize a resistance. He had done it for 500 kilometers across the desert, and he saw no reason why this day would be any different. But the men of the Australian 20th Battalion, dug into the rocky soil, did not run, they did not panic, they did not retreat, and they most certainly did not surrender. Instead, they did something that defied every tactical manual the Germans had ever read. They waited. They let the terrifying German tanks rumble closer, closing the distance to 200, then 300 meters, point-blank range in desert warfare. Only when the steel monsters were practically on top of them did they open fire with everything they had. Anti-tank guns, captured Italian artillery, and even Molotov cocktails rained down on the stunned German crews. The German tankers, accustomed to seeing British infantry scatter at the mere sight of their panzers, suddenly found themselves in a kill zone they could not escape. The result of that first day was an absolute shock to the German high command. 17 German tanks lay burning or disabled in front of the Australian lines, their crews scrambling for cover under withering fire. The infantry of the 5th Light Division, which was supposed to exploit the breakthrough, was pinned down and forced to retreat to their starting positions. Rommel, who had spent the last week and a half chasing a routed enemy, had been stopped cold for the first time in the campaign. The so-called hopeless soldiers had not given up a single meter of ground. Instead of breaking, they had counterattacked, with infantrymen leaping from their trenches to engage tanks with grenades and improvised explosives, targeting engine decks and tracks with a ferocity that bordered on madness. But this was only the first blow, and the Desert Fox was not a man to give up after one failure. On April 14th, Rommel launched a second, even more ferocious attempt, shifting his focus to a different sector of the perimeter and throwing even more armor into the fight. Again, the tanks roared forward, again the artillery pounded the defenses, and again the German command expected a collapse, and again they were met with the same stubborn, organized, and lethal resistance. Leslie Moreshead, controlling the battle like a grandmaster, shifted his meager reserves to plug gaps and reinforce threatened sectors with surgical precision. His doctrine, not a single meter without an immediate counterattack, worked flawlessly. Every time the Germans managed to wedge themselves into the defenses, Australian infantry would descend on their flanks, cutting off the spearheads and destroying them in brutal close-quarters combat, where the tanks lost their primary advantage. In the days and weeks that followed, the situation for the Germans turned from frustrating to downright humiliating. Rommel threw attack after attack at Tobruk on April 30th, on May 1st, on May 3rd, and each time he smashed against the Australian defense like a wave against a granite breakwater. The losses of the Afrika Korps mounted with every assault. German soldiers, who just 2 weeks ago had considered themselves invincible conquerors of North Africa, began to look at the Australian lines with undisguised fear. And it was here, in the cold desert nights, that one of the most terrifying legends of the siege was born: the night raids. The Australians refused to sit passively behind their concrete and barbed wire. Every night, small groups of 5 to 10 men, armed with bayonets, grenades, and captured weapons, would slip out of the perimeter and into the no-man's land. They moved like ghosts, silent and deadly, penetrating deep into German positions to slit throats, capture prisoners, and sow chaos. These raids were not just about inflicting casualties, they were psychological warfare of the highest order. Sleeping on the front line opposite the Australians became impossible for the German troops. Every rustle in the dark, every shadow, could mean a bayonet in the ribs. German prisoners later confessed during interrogations that entire units simply refused to post sentries at night on sectors where they knew the Australians were waiting. This was a war of nerves, and the Australians were winning it by a landslide. Meanwhile, inside the besieged fortress, the conditions of daily life were a nightmare that would have broken lesser men. The supply line to Tobruk was a thin, precarious thread known as the Tobruk Express, small convoys of destroyers and transport ships that ran the gauntlet of Luftwaffe bombers and U-boats to deliver vital supplies under the cover of darkness. Everything was in short supply. Ammunition had to be hoarded like gold. Food was monotonous and scarce. Bully beef, hardtack biscuits, and tinned beans were the staple diet for weeks on end. Fresh water was strictly rationed, with an allowance that barely reached 1 liter per man per day for all needs: drinking, cooking, and washing. In the searing heat of the Libyan summer, where temperatures soared to 50 degrees Celsius, this was torture. And yet it was precisely here that the Australian soldiers' genius for improvisation, what the British sneered at as poverty, shone brightest. Men who had grown up on remote farms where the nearest mechanic was 200 kilometers away knew how to fix anything with nothing. When standard hand grenades ran out, they began manufacturing their own from empty jam tins packed with scrap metal, barbed wire clippings, and explosives scavenged from unexploded Italian shells. When mortars malfunctioned, mechanics who were former bush engineers built improvised ones from water pipes. When anti-tank weapons were scarce, soldiers learned to disable enemy vehicles by jamming bundles of grenades into their tracks. Captured weapons, Italian machine guns, German mortars, anything they could drag back from a night raid were put to use so extensively that German intelligence at one point seriously believed the garrison was receiving massive reinforcements. British units trapped inside the perimeter initially looked at their colonial allies with a mix of condescension and bewilderment, but that attitude evaporated faster than water in the desert sun. Within a week of the siege, the tone changed radically. The same officers who had complained about unshaven faces and unbuttoned tunics now retreated to the safety of Australian sectors when German tanks threatened their own lines. The British Second Support Group and other units owed their survival to the fact that the Australian perimeter stood as an immovable wall, giving them time to regroup and dig in. The Australians shared their meager rations, their water, and their expertise in desert survival, forging a bond that transcended the rigid hierarchy of the British military system. But the most significant validation came not from their allies, but from the enemy, and it was worth more than any medal. The German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, decided to break the spirit of the defenders by mocking them. Berlin radio began broadcasting taunts, calling the garrison the poor rats of Tobruk, caught in a trap and awaiting extermination. Leaflets dropped by Luftwaffe planes depicted starving rats in Australian slouch hats, cowering in holes as the German eagle swooped down. The calculation was simple. Comparing soldiers to vermin would humiliate them, strip them of their dignity, and crush their morale. It was a classic psychological operation, designed to make the defenders feel subhuman and hopeless. It backfired spectacularly. Instead of being insulted, the Australians embraced the name with a perverse, defiant pride. They started calling themselves the Rats of Tobruk. They made homemade badges out of scrap metal shaped like rats and pinned them to their uniforms. They greeted each other as fellow rats. The logic was simple and devastatingly direct. If the most powerful army in Europe, led by its most brilliant general, cannot smoke us out of our holes after months of trying, then we must be bloody good rats. The nickname became a badge of honor, a symbol of their stubborn refusal to die. Years later, the Rats of Tobruk medal would become one of the most cherished decorations a veteran could wear, a testament to the fact that they had endured hell and come out smiling. But the siege was far from over, and the pressure continued to mount with every passing week. Rommel could not afford to leave Tobruk unconquered. The fortress, sticking like a bone in his throat, threatened his supply lines and prevented him from throwing his full strength into the drive toward Egypt and the Suez Canal. He continued to attack, again and again, with a regularity that turned life in the garrison into a continuous cycle of bombardment and close-quarters combat. Every assault was repelled, but every assault cost the defenders casualties that were impossible to replace. The wounded were evacuated by sea on the return trips of the Tobruk Express, but reinforcements arrived only in trickles. Diseases, dysentery, malaria, desert sores began to take a toll as heavy as German shells. By the middle of the summer of 1941, the physical and psychological state of the garrison was stretched to the breaking point. Archibald Wavell, the same commander-in-chief who had ordered Moreshead to hold out for 8 weeks, tried twice to relieve Tobruk with offensives from the outside, Operation Brevity in May and Operation Battle Axe in June. Both failed miserably. British tanks, thrown into battle without proper reconnaissance or coordination, burned by the dozens on German anti-tank screens. Wavell was relieved of command and replaced by General Claude Auchinleck, but Tobruk remained under siege, isolated and defiant. Moreshead, meanwhile, continued to do what he did best, hold the line with a minimum of resources and a maximum of stubbornness. He introduced a rotation system where units on the front line of the perimeter were regularly swapped with those resting in the rear of the fortress, often near the harbor. This allowed the men to maintain some semblance of combat effectiveness despite their exhaustion. He organized a system of underground shelters and communication trenches that allowed reinforcements to be moved to any threatened point of the perimeter without being exposed to enemy fire. He established a system for collecting and repairing captured weapons, turning it into an almost industrial process. Every machine gun or mortar seized in a night raid was immediately cleaned, repaired, and turned against its former owners. 242 days, almost 8 months. It was the longest siege in the history of the British Commonwealth in the Second World War. When Operation Crusader finally broke the siege in December 1941 and the 9th Division was evacuated by sea, the men leaving were not the same ones the British colonel had called hopeless in April. They were hardened, ruthless, exhausted, but undefeated veterans who had shattered the plans of Germany's best tank general. Rommel later admitted in his papers that the Siege of Tobruk had broken his heart and ruined the momentum of his entire North African campaign. No other garrison in the entire Mediterranean theater had caused the Afrika Korps so much grief. But if you think the story ended there, you are mistaken, because the most humiliating twist for the skeptics happened exactly 1 year later. In June 1942, Tobruk fell, but not while the Australians were defending it. By that time, the 9th Division had long been withdrawn from the fortress. The garrison had been replaced by the South African 2nd Division and units of the 11th Indian Brigade, and the unthinkable happened. Rommel took Tobruk in a single day. On June 21, 1942, 33,000 men surrendered to the Germans after just 24 hours of resistance. The very same fortress that the Australians had held for 242 days without tanks or air support fell in one day when defended by other troops. Winston Churchill, who received the news of the fall of Tobruk while visiting Roosevelt in Washington, called it one of the heaviest blows of the entire war. The contrast was lethal: 242 days versus one single day. The numbers spoke for themselves, and no British staff officer could ever again claim that the Australians were hopeless without blushing in shame. But the 9th Division still had one more act to play in this drama, and it would turn out to be perhaps the most impressive of all. After their evacuation from Tobruk, the division was sent to Palestine for rest and refitting. The soldiers, many of whom had spent over a year in the desert, finally had a chance to wash, sleep, and eat normal food. But the rest did not last long. By the autumn of 1942, the situation in North Africa had once again become critical. Rommel, emboldened by the fall of Tobruk, was driving toward Egypt. His tank columns had advanced to El Alamein, the last defensive line before Alexandria and the Suez Canal. If the Germans broke through this line, they would gain control of the oil fields of the Middle East, and the entire course of the World War could change. The new commander of the British Eighth Army, General Bernard Montgomery, a man with an immense ego and a talent for self-promotion, began preparing a massive offensive. He needed the best units available, and he knew exactly who they were. The 9th Australian Division was transferred to the El Alamein line and positioned on the extreme northern flank, closest to the Mediterranean coast. It was this sector that Montgomery identified as key. A breakthrough in the north was intended to draw Rommel's attention and reserves away from the center, creating the conditions for the main blow. And once again, as if following a script that had already played out at Tobruk, the familiar voices of skeptics began to sound before the operation commenced. Some British staff officers expressed doubts about the combat readiness of the Australians after months of so-called rest. One of them, according to post-war memoirs, remarked that the Australians might have lost their edge and would not be able to withstand intense combat with the Afrika Korps, which had only grown stronger and more experienced over the past year. Montgomery, to his credit, ignored these voices. He had studied the history of Tobruk and knew what the 9th Division was capable of. On October 23, 1942, at 21:40 hours, 1,030 British and Dominion guns opened fire simultaneously on German positions along the entire front. It was one of the most powerful artillery barrages of the entire war in North Africa. The earth shook, the horizon burned with flashes, and the roar could be heard in Alexandria, more than 100 kilometers from the front line. Operation Lightfoot had begun. The 9th Australian Division went forward on its northern sector exactly at 22 hours. Before them lay a minefield several kilometers deep, behind which were carefully fortified German and Italian positions. Sappers went first, clearing paths through the minefields under continuous fire. Behind them came the infantry, tasked with seizing and holding enemy trenches until the tanks could arrive. Casualties began within the first minutes. Mines, artillery, and machine gun fire mowed down the advancing ranks, but the Australians kept moving forward, silently, without shouting "Quote 11," without cinematic charges, in full view. They crawled, dashed, crawled again, reached enemy positions, and captured them in brutal close-quarters combat. In the first 2 days, the 9th Division advanced several kilometers deep into the German defenses and captured key heights that controlled the coastal road. The losses were heavy, but the positions were taken and held. This advance created a threat of encirclement for the entire northern flank of Rommel's army and forced him to transfer reserves from other sectors of the front, weakening the defense exactly where Montgomery was preparing his main strike. In the following days, the fighting on the northern sector took on a character of unprecedented ferocity. Rommel, realizing the threat, threw his best units, the 90th Light Division and elements of the 21st Panzer Division, into counterattacks against the Australians. The battle for Hill 28, known as Tel El Asa, turned into a continuous meat grinder, where positions changed hands several times a day. The Australians fought with the same fury that had distinguished them in Tobruk, a counterattack for every enemy thrust, not a meter back without a fight, using every scrap of terrain to their advantage. It was these battles in the north that allowed Montgomery to deliver the decisive blow. On November 2nd, Operation Supercharge began, a breakthrough in the center of the front, which became possible because Rommel had diverted his best units to fight the Australians. On November 4th, the German defense collapsed, and the Afrika Korps began a retreat that would end only in Tunisia, thousands of kilometers from El Alamein. The victory at El Alamein became the turning point of the entire North African campaign, and it is impossible to deny that the so-called hopeless Australians played a key role in it. But the cost was monstrous, and this was precisely what was glossed over in British victory dispatches. The 9th Australian Division lost more than 5,800 men at El Alamein. These were the heaviest casualties among all the divisions of the 8th Army in this battle. On some sectors of the front, battalions lost up to 50% of their personnel in a matter of days. The 26th Brigade, advancing on the coastal sector, was bled so dry that after the battle, it had to be reformed practically from scratch. Every meter won from Rommel was paid for with Australian blood, and these were not abstract numbers in staff reports, but specific people. Farmers from Queensland, miners from New South Wales, dockers from Melbourne, the very same boys whom British colonels had dismissed as a mob in uniform. Montgomery paid tribute to the 9th Division after the battle, calling their actions magnificent. But in his post-war memoirs, he, as was his habit, tried to attribute most of the credit to himself and his strategic genius. Australian historians have subsequently noted this characteristic Montgomery tactic more than once, using the best units in the hottest spots and then claiming the victory for his own tactical mastery. However, for the men who fought on Hill 28, it was deeply indifferent who got the laurels. They wanted only one thing: to return home alive. And here lies one of the most remarkable aspects of this entire story, the validation that came not from friends, but from the enemy. German military documents captured after the war, along with the memoirs of Wehrmacht officers, paint a picture that differs radically from the condescending assessments of the British staff. The Afrika Korps regarded the Australians with genuine respect, bordering on fear. In one captured German intelligence bulletin dating back to the Siege of Tobruk, it was explicitly stated that Australian units should be considered a first-class opponent, whose night raids and aggressive defense created problems completely disproportionate to their numbers. German soldiers on the front line, according to prisoner testimonies, developed their own classification of enemy units by danger level, and the Australians consistently appeared at the very top of that list. Erwin Rommel, whose post-war correspondence and notes were partially published by his son Manfred, admitted that the Australians were among the most dangerous adversaries he had ever faced. A formulation attributed to him in various sources stated that the Afrika Korps respected the Australians as opponents, but believed that their potential was not always fully exploited by British generals. This phrase is pure poison disguised as a compliment. Rommel simultaneously paid tribute to the Australian soldiers and struck a blow at their British commanders, who, in his opinion, did not understand what weapon they had at their disposal. The irony was bitter. The very men London dismissed as a rabble were the ones Berlin feared most. The twist of fate was that the main weakness of the Australians in the eyes of the British command, their so-called lack of discipline, turned out to be their greatest strength. The British military doctrine of the 1940s was built on a rigid vertical hierarchy. An order comes down from above, the soldier executes it, and initiative is not welcomed. This worked on parade grounds and during inspections, but it proved deadly on the battlefield, where the situation changed every 5 minutes. German panzers would break through defenses, headquarters would lose contact, an officer would be taken out of action, and the entire system would collapse because the soldiers did not know what to do without an order from above. They froze, waiting for instructions that would never come. The Australians functioned differently. Their lack of discipline was actually distributed initiative, what modern military science calls mission command. Every sergeant, every corporal, every private understood the overall objective and was ready to act independently without waiting for a command. If a platoon commander was taken out, the platoon did not fall into a stupor. The nearest sergeant took command and continued the fight. If contact with the battalion was lost, the company acted at its own discretion based on the general plan. This was not anarchy. It was the discipline of result, not the discipline of form. And what is truly striking is that this principle, which British generals in 1941 considered a sign of hopelessness, was subsequently adopted by all the leading armies of the world. Modern special forces, from the British SAS to the American Delta Force, build their tactics precisely on distributed initiative, the autonomy of small groups, and the ability to act without constant control from above. The Australians practiced this half a century before military theorists came up with a fancy name for it. They didn't do it because they read it in a manual, but because it was the only way they knew how to operate. But let's look closer at who these men actually were, the 14,000 Australians who found themselves in Tobruk in April 1941. The 9th Division was formed mainly from volunteers from the states of Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia. The average age of a fighter was 26 to 28 years old, but there were also very young boys who had added a year or two to their age to get into the recruitment center, and mature men over 40 who had gone through the First World War and returned to service because they considered it their duty. One thing united them all: they were volunteers. Australia did not introduce conscription for overseas operations, and every man in Tobruk was there by his own choice. This fact fundamentally changed the psychology of the unit. A man who came to fight voluntarily fights completely differently from one who is forced. The biographies of these men read like an encyclopedia of the Australian outback. Among them were shearers capable of shearing 100 sheep a day. Their hands were so strong and dexterous that they could reload a Lee Enfield rifle twice as fast as the manual prescribed. There were gold prospectors from Western Australia, accustomed to living in the desert for weeks with a jerrycan of water and a bag of biscuits. For them, the conditions of Tobruk were almost a resort. There were loggers from the Tasmanian forests whose sense of direction and ability to orient themselves in zero visibility made them ideal scouts for night raids. There were dockers and stevedores from Sydney and Melbourne, men with iron fists and short tempers who felt right at home in close-quarters combat. And there was one element that united all these completely different people and turned them into a single whole: mateship. This word has no exact translation into any language in the world. It is not just comradeship and not just brotherhood in arms. It is a deep code rooted in the harsh life of the Australian interior, where a man without a partner is a man doomed to perish. A mate is someone you will not abandon under any circumstances, not because of an order, not because of an oath, but because otherwise it is impossible. This code was stronger than any regulation and tougher than any military tribunal. A soldier could get drunk, could be rude to an officer, could fail a parade inspection, but he could not abandon a comrade. It was unthinkable, impossible, worse than treason. It is precisely mateship that explains the phenomenon of night raids in Tobruk. Rationally, there was no sense in them. The garrison was already barely holding the perimeter. Why risk lives going outside the defense? But the raids continued every night because it was a matter of honor, not state honor, not regimental honor, but the personal honor of every soldier before his comrades. To show fear meant letting your mates down. To refuse a raid meant losing respect. And so they went into the dark, armed with bayonets and grenades, simply because the man next to them was going too. However, we must be honest and not idealize the picture completely. There was a dark side to this story, and the statistics of offenses among Australians were indeed several times higher than the average for the Eighth Army. Unauthorized absences, drunkenness, brawls, and theft were commonplace. The famous Battle of Cairo in 1942, where Australian and New Zealand soldiers smashed up several city blocks in a massive clash with military police, is a historical fact. But here is the key nuance that the British command missed. None of these offenses affected combat effectiveness. Yesterday's brawler in a bar became today's cold-blooded raider. Their discipline was selective. They obeyed a sergeant who had earned respect in battle, but ignored a general who, in their opinion, had not earned the right to command them. And finally, success is not only about soldiers, but also about the commander who understood them. Leslie Moreshead, the school teacher from Melbourne, understood perfectly that an Australian soldier would follow a commander only if he shared the danger. Moreshead spent time on the front line, not in a safe headquarters bunker. He knew his men, and they knew he would never send them where he would not go himself. The command structure in the 9th Division was built on meritocracy. Officers were promoted not by origin or pedigree, but by competence. A farmer could become a lieutenant, a teacher could become a captain if they showed they could lead men under fire. This created a stark contrast with the British Army, where the path from private to officer was practically impossible due to class barriers. In the Australian Army, stars on shoulder straps were earned by deeds, not by birthright. If the combat was hell, the logistics were a nightmare of biblical proportions. For nearly 8 months, the survival of 25,000 men hung on a lifeline as thin as a spider's web, the Tobruk Express. Old destroyers and slow transport ships, overloaded to the point of capsizing, ran the gauntlet of the Mediterranean night after night. They had to navigate waters infested with German U-boats and skies dominated by the Luftwaffe, docking in a harbor littered with the wrecks of their predecessors. Dozens of ships were sent to the bottom, taking their precious cargo of ammunition and food with them. When a ship did make it through, the crews had a window of just 2 or 3 hours to unload hundreds of tons of cargo in pitch darkness before the sun rose and the bombers returned. It was a race against time played out every single night with the lives of the garrison as the stakes. Inside the perimeter, life was stripped down to the absolute basics of survival. The daily water ration was set at 2 pints, just over 1 liter, per man for everything. Drinking, cooking, washing, and shaving all had to come out of that one bottle. In the 50-degree heat of the Libyan summer, this was barely enough to keep kidneys functioning. Men learned to wash their hands with sand to save moisture. Water used for washing a face was saved to cool down machine guns. Even the wounded in the field hospitals received no extra ration. Equality and deprivation was the unwritten law of the siege. If you were thirsty, your mate was thirsty too, and that made it bearable. Food was another form of torture. The menu consisted almost entirely of bully beef, canned salted meat, and rock-hard biscuits that had to be soaked in water just to be chewable. But the Australian genius for improvisation, the bush mechanic spirit, found a way even here. Soldiers invented the Tobruk fritter, a culinary abomination made of crushed biscuits and bully beef fried in whatever grease they could find, sometimes even strained motor oil. It tasted like despair, but it kept them alive. They turned scarcity into a challenge, a game of wits against the environment. When there was nothing, they made something. When there was no hope, they made a joke. This ability to laugh in the face of misery was a weapon the Germans simply did not possess. But beyond the grit and the humor, the strategic impact of this stubborn resistance cannot be overstated. By holding Tobruk for 8 long months, the rats tied Rommel's hands completely. The Afrika Korps, the finest armored force in the world, was stuck in the desert, unable to move. Every tank destroyed in front of the Australian perimeter was a tank that did not reach the Egyptian border. Every battalion pinned down in the siege lines was a battalion that could not march on the Suez Canal. The British High Command had been ready to ride off Tobruk, to surrender it without a fight to save their forces. The Australians refused, and in doing so, they changed the strategic balance of the entire war. Most historians agree today, without the Australian stand at Tobruk, North Africa would have been lost, the Suez Canal would have fallen, and the oil of the Middle East would have fueled Hitler's war machine. Yet, history is written by the victors, and sometimes the victors have short memories. In the post-war narratives, the contribution of the 9th Division was conveniently pushed into the background. Field Marshal Montgomery, in his memoirs, claimed the glory of Alamein almost entirely for himself, barely acknowledging the Australians who had broken the German line for him. Winston Churchill, in his monumental history of the Second World War, mentioned the Siege of Tobruk in passing, focusing more on the broader strategic picture than on the men who actually held the line. Hollywood added insult to injury in 1967 with a film about Tobruk that featured American actors and a plot that had little to do with reality. The Australians were relegated to the role of extras in their own story. Leslie Moreshead, the man who held the unholdable, remained largely unknown outside his homeland, overshadowed by the flamboyant figures of Montgomery and Patton. It was unfair, yes, but in a strange way, it was perfectly Australian. The culture of the digger has never been about seeking glory or applause. It is about doing the job, looking after your mates, and going home. True heroes, in their view, do not need to shout about their achievements. The silence of the desert and the respect of their enemies were validation enough. They knew what they had done, and they knew that without them, the map of the world would look very different today. But the story of the 9th Division had one final defiant chapter, a political one. After the bloodbath of Alamein, the Australian government, led by Prime Minister John Curtin, made a decision that sent shockwaves through London. Japan had entered the war, and the threat to the Australian mainland was real and immediate. Curtin demanded the return of the 9th Division to defend their own homes in the Pacific. Churchill was furious. He was accustomed to using Dominion troops as he saw fit, moving them around the global chessboard like pawns. He tried to bully, to cajole, to guilt-trip Curtin into leaving the division in the Middle East. But Curtin stood firm. He reminded Churchill that Australia was a sovereign nation, not a military base of the Crown. The 9th Division was coming home. It was a symbolic transition, a moment when Australia learned to say, quote, "for" to the mother country. The defiance that the soldiers had shown to British officers in the desert was now being shown by their government to the British Prime Minister. The, quote, "5" were not just fighting for the empire anymore, they were fighting for themselves. The 9th Division sailed east, trading the sands of Libya for the jungles of New Guinea and Borneo, where they would continue to fight with the same ferocity until the very end of the war. So let's look at the numbers one last time, because they tell the truth that no memoir can hide. 242 days of siege, 5,800 casualties at El Alamein, 17 tanks destroyed in a single morning, 1 cup of water a day, grenades made of jam tins, night raids with bayonets, and one phrase that started it all: send them home, they're hopeless, They stayed, they fought, and they saved everyone. The next time you hear someone talk about discipline, remember the rats of Tobruk. Remember that real discipline isn't about how shiny your boots are or how loudly you can shout, quote, 8. It's about holding the line when everyone else has run away. It's about looking a tank in the eye and not blinking. It's about knowing that you are the only thing standing between your friends and destruction. That is the lesson of the 9th Division. That is the legacy of the hopeless soldiers who became the greatest defenders the desert had ever seen.